The morning sun barely peeked through the airport windows as Thomas boarded his flight to Chicago. His eyes were heavy from staying up all night, going over the final papers for the big company takeover. No one knew yet that he was about to become the new CEO of Skyway Airlines. That announcement would come after he landed. Thomas found his seat in first class and sank into it with a sigh of relief. He'd chosen to wear comfortable clothes for the flight, a plain t-shirt, jeans, and his favorite worn sneakers, a far cry from the suits he usually wore to business meetings, but perfect for a 5-hour flight after a sleepless night. Finally, he whispered to himself as he closed his eyes for a moment. The cool air conditioning and soft leather seat were already working their magic. Maybe he could catch a quick nap before takeoff. "Excuse me, sir?" Thomas opened his eyes to see a flight attendant standing over him. Her name tag read Rebecca. She had her arms crossed and was looking at him with obvious suspicion. "Yes?" Thomas answered, giving her a tired smile. "I think you might be in the wrong section," Rebecca said, her voice crisp and professional but with an edge to it. "This is first class." Thomas nodded. "Yes, I know. I have a first-class ticket." He reached for his phone to pull up his boarding pass. Rebecca's eyebrows rose slightly. "Are you sure? Economy boarding isn't for another 20 minutes. "I'm positive," Thomas said, finding his ticket on his phone and holding it up for her to see. "Seat 2A. That's this one, right?" Rebecca barely glanced at the screen. "There must be some mistake. Let me see your actual boarding pass, please." Thomas felt a flicker of annoyance but kept his voice calm. "This is my boarding pass. It's digital." He zoomed in so she could see the details more clearly. "Look, it says first class, seat 2A. A businessman across the aisle looked up from his newspaper, watching the exchange with growing interest. A few other passengers were starting to notice too. Rebecca shook her head. "Sir, there seems to be a mix-up. These seats are quite expensive and I know how much they cost." Thomas interrupted gently. "I paid for this seat. Is there a problem with my ticket?" More passengers were boarding now, walking past the increasingly tense scene. Some slowed down to watch, while others quickly found their seats, trying not to stare. "Let me check with my supervisor," Rebecca said, her lips pressed into a thin line. She walked away without another word, disappearing toward the front of the plane. Thomas took a deep breath. He'd dealt with this kind of thing before, though not often on planes. He pulled out his laptop, figuring he might as well get some work done while waiting for this to be sorted out. A few minutes later, Rebecca returned with another flight attendant, a tall man with graying hair whose name tag read Paul. "Sir," Paul said, his voice lower and more authoritative than Rebecca's had been, "there seems to be some confusion about your seating assignment." Thomas looked up from his laptop. "There's no confusion on my end. I booked and paid for this seat." He showed his boarding pass again. "First class, seat 2A. That's where I'm sitting." Paul glanced at the phone screen, then at Thomas. "May I see some ID, please?" Thomas felt his jaw tighten, but he reached for his wallet. "Is this standard procedure for all your first-class passengers or just me?" he asked, handing over his driver's license. Paul didn't answer the question. He studied the ID for a moment, then handed it back. "The name matches, but there still seems to be an issue with the system. Rebecca says this seat should be empty today." "Well, it's not empty. I'm sitting in it," Thomas said, his patience wearing thin. "I booked it 3 weeks ago." By now, most of the first-class cabin was full, and everyone was watching the drama unfold. Thomas noticed a few passengers whispering to each other, and one woman was recording the incident with her phone. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy for now until we can sort this out," Paul said firmly. Thomas shook his head. "No, I paid for this seat. If there's a problem with your system, that's not my fault. Check again." Rebecca leaned in and whispered something to Paul. He nodded and turned back to Thomas. "Sir, if you won't cooperate, we'll have to call security." Thomas stared at them in disbelief. "Call security? For what? I'm sitting in the seat I paid for." "You're delaying the flight," Rebecca said coldly. "All the other passengers are ready to go." Thomas looked around. It was true that most people were seated now, but Several were still stowing their bags or settling in. The plane wasn't even fully boarded yet. "This is ridiculous," Thomas said. "Let me speak to the captain." "The captain is busy preparing for takeoff," Paul replied. "Sir, this is your final warning. Either move to economy voluntarily, or we'll have security escort you there." Thomas felt a familiar knot in his stomach, the same one he felt whenever he was singled out for no reason. He'd worked too hard and come too far to be treated this way. Tomorrow he would be announced as the new CEO of this very airline, but today he was just another passenger being profiled. "I'm not moving," Thomas said quietly but firmly. "I paid for this seat, and I have every right to sit here." Paul shook his head and walked away, speaking into his radio. Rebecca stayed, watching Thomas as if he might try to make a run for it. The minutes ticked by uncomfortably. Some passengers were giving Thomas sympathetic looks, while others seemed annoyed at the delay. Thomas tried to focus on his laptop, but it was hard to concentrate with Rebecca hovering nearby. Eventually, 2 airport security officers appeared at the entrance to first class. They spoke briefly with Paul, who pointed toward Thomas. "Sir," one of the officers said as they approached, "we need you to come with us." Thomas closed his laptop slowly. "On what grounds?" "You're refusing to comply with crew member instructions, which is a violation of federal regulations," the officer said, his hand resting near his taser. Thomas looked around at the other passengers, many of whom were now openly recording the scene. "I'm being asked to give up a seat I paid for because of a mistake in their system. How is that reasonable?" The second officer moved closer. "Sir, we can discuss this off the plane. Right now, you need to come with us." Thomas could see this wasn't going to end well if he kept resisting. As much as it infuriated him, he knew that in situations like this, keeping calm was the safest option. He slowly packed up his laptop and stood. "I want all your names and badge numbers," he said quietly, looking at the officers, Paul and Rebecca in turn. "And I want it noted that I'm complying under protest." "Noted," the first officer said, not writing anything down. "Now please come." "With us?" As Thomas was escorted down the aisle, he could feel the stares of everyone on board. Some passengers looked embarrassed, others curious, and a few seemed satisfied, as if justice was being served. Thomas kept his head high, determined not to show how deeply this humiliated him. At the back of the plane, in economy class, the officers found an empty middle seat. "You can sit here for now," one of them said. "If you cause any more trouble, you'll be removed from the flight entirely." Thomas sat down, squeezed between 2 other passengers who shifted uncomfortably away from him. He took out his phone and started making calls. First to his assistant, then to his lawyer. "Jerry, it's me," he said quietly when his lawyer answered. "You're not going to believe what just happened." As Thomas explained the situation, the other passengers pretended not to listen, but he could tell they were hanging on every word. When he mentioned that he was about to become the new CEO of Skyway Airlines, the woman next to him couldn't help but gasp. Up in first class, Rebecca was straightening the seat Thomas had been forced to leave. "Some people just don't know their place," she said to another flight attendant. Paul nodded. "Good job handling that. The captain says we'll be taking off in about 10 minutes. Neither of them knew that at that very moment, Thomas's assistant was calling the airline's headquarters with news that would turn their world upside down. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Thomas finished his call and leaned back in his cramped economy seat. Despite the anger and humiliation burning inside him, a small, grim smile played on his lips. "Tomorrow is going to be very interesting," he thought to himself as the engines roared to life. The plane shuddered as it climbed through the clouds. Thomas sat uncomfortably in his middle seat, wedged between a man who had spread his elbows across both armrests and an elderly woman who had fallen asleep against the window. His knees pressed painfully against the seat in front of him, a stark contrast to the spacious first-class seat he had paid for. Around him, passengers whispered and pointed. Many had witnessed his humiliating removal from first class. Others had already seen snippets of video on social media, shared by the passengers who had recorded the incident. The news was spreading faster than the plane itself. Aren't you the guy they just dragged out of first class? Asked a teenager across the aisle, not bothering to lower his voice. Thomas gave a small nod but didn't engage further. He was busy texting his assistant. Need you to contact the board immediately. There's been an incident on the flight. His phone pinged with responses almost instantly. Already on it. Videos are hitting Twitter. Board members calling in. What happened? Thomas typed quickly, explaining the situation. As he finished, a flight attendant, not Rebecca or Paul, approached him. Sir, we're at cruising altitude now. The captain has asked me to check if you're comfortable. Her voice was overly polite, her smile strained. Thomas looked up at her, noting how different her treatment was from what he'd experienced earlier. I'm as comfortable as anyone can be in a middle seat in economy when they've paid for first class, he replied calmly. Has there been some new development I should know about? The flight attendant shifted her weight from one foot to the other. I'm not sure what you mean, sir. I was just asked to check on you. Interesting, Thomas said. Because 30 minutes ago I was a problem that needed to be removed. Now I'm a guest whose comfort is a concern. He gestured to his phone. Would that have anything to do with the calls I've been making? She didn't answer directly. Can I get you anything, sir? A drink, perhaps? Some snacks? I'd like to speak to Rebecca and Paul, Thomas said, and I'd like the contact information for your HR department. I'll see what I can do, she replied, hurrying away. The man next to Thomas whistled low. Man, whatever you said on that phone lit a fire under them. You somebody important? Thomas gave a tired smile. Just someone who doesn't appreciate being discriminated against. His phone buzzed again. A message from his lawyer. 3 different videos of the incident online now. Clear case of discrimination. Press already calling for comment. How do you want to handle this? Thomas sighed. This wasn't how he'd planned to introduce himself to the company he was about to lead. Tomorrow's announcement was supposed to be a positive new beginning. Now, his first act as CEO would be dealing with a PR crisis caused by the airline's own staff. He replied to his lawyer, No comment yet. Let's see how they handle it first. At the front of the plane, chaos was unfolding. Rebecca stood frozen as Paul showed her a message on his tablet. This can't be right, she whispered, her face pale. How would he know? It came directly from headquarters, Paul hissed. They say he's... Don't say it out loud, Rebecca interrupted, glancing nervously at the first-class passengers. This has to be a mistake, Paul shook his head. It's not. They confirmed his identity. And apparently the board is having an emergency meeting right now because of what we did. Rebecca felt sick. What do we do? The captain wants to see us both. Now. Paul's voice was grim. In the cockpit, the captain was on the radio with airline headquarters, his expression growing more concerned by the minute. When Rebecca and Paul entered, he held up a hand to silence them while he finished his call. Yes, sir. I understand the gravity of the situation, he was saying. We'll do everything we can to make this right. He hung up and turned to face the flight attendants. Would either of you care to explain why you removed our incoming CEO from his rightful seat in first class? His voice was quiet but filled with barely contained anger. Rebecca's mouth opened and closed without sound. Paul stepped forward. There was a misunderstanding about his ticket, sir. The system showed nothing of the sort, the captain cut him off. I've just confirmed that Mr. Thomas Johnson had a valid first-class ticket, which he paid for himself. So I'm wondering what exactly led you to assume he didn't belong there. The unspoken accusation hung in the air between them. We didn't, Rebecca stammered. Save it, the captain said. Right now, we have a bigger problem. Thanks to your actions, our incoming CEO's first experience with our airline was being humiliated and physically removed from a seat he paid for. Videos of this incident are already viral on social media. The board is in emergency session and our stock is taking a hit. He turned to look out the cockpit window for a moment, collecting himself. This is what you're going to do. You're going to go back there, apologize profusely, and offer to return him to his rightful seat in first class. You're going to do it in front of the same passengers who witnessed his removal. And you're going to pray that he's a forgiving man. Back in economy, Thomas was reviewing documents on his phone when the chief flight attendant appeared beside him. She wasn't one he'd seen before. "Mr. Johnson," she said quietly. "I'm Lisa, the chief flight attendant on this flight. I'd like to personally apologize for the inexcusable treatment you've received today. We've confirmed that there was no issue with your ticket, and we'd like to escort you back to your first-class seat immediately." Thomas looked up at her, then at Rebecca and Paul, who stood a few steps behind her, looking as though they'd rather be anywhere else. "And what about them?" he asked, nodding toward the two flight attendants who had removed him. "Do they have anything to say?" Lisa stepped aside, making space for Rebecca and Paul to approach. Neither moved at first until Lisa cleared her throat loudly. Paul stepped forward first. "Sir, I apologize for the misunderstanding earlier. It was unprofessional of me." His apology sounded rehearsed and hollow. Thomas waited, saying nothing. Rebecca stepped up next, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere over Thomas's shoulder. "I'm sorry for the confusion about your seat, sir." Thomas nodded slowly. "Confusion? Is that what we're calling it?" He looked at Lisa. "I appreciate the offer to return to my seat, but I think I'll stay right here." Lisa's eyes widened. "Sir, please, we insist. First class is where you belong." "Is it?" Thomas replied. "That's not what your colleagues thought an hour ago." He gestured around him. "I think I'll stay here for the remainder of the flight. It'll give me a better perspective on the customer experience." Several nearby passengers were recording this exchange too. Thomas knew these videos would also end up online, alongside the earlier ones. Good. Transparency would be one of his core values as CEO. "As you wish, sir," Lisa said, clearly uncomfortable. "Is there anything we can bring you?" "Just one thing," Thomas said. "I'd like an incident report form. I want to document exactly what happened today while it's still fresh." Lisa nodded quickly. "Of course, I'll bring that right away." As the three flight attendants retreated, whispers exploded throughout the cabin. Did she say CEO? He's the boss? Oh man, they are so fired. Thomas ignored the buzz around him and returned to his phone. There were dozens of messages now, from board members, from his transition team, from the current CEO. All of them were frantically trying to contain the damage. A message from the board chair caught his eye. "This is a disaster. Should we postpone tomorrow's announcement?" Thomas considered it for a moment, then typed back, "No, move it up. I want to address this head on. Set up a press conference for when we land." He put his phone down and closed his eyes, planning what he would say. This wasn't the beginning he had envisioned, but perhaps it was the beginning the airline needed. In the galley, Rebecca leaned against the wall, fighting back tears. "We're going to lose our jobs." Paul nodded grimly. "Probably, but it's worse than that. Did you see how many people were filming? By the time we land, everyone will know what we did." Lisa, who had been gathering paperwork for Thomas, turned to them with a hard look. "What exactly did you think you were doing? We're trained better than this." "The system showed his seat should be empty," Rebecca insisted weakly. "Did you actually check the system?" Lisa asked. "Because I just did, and it clearly shows he was assigned that seat 3 weeks ago." Rebecca and Paul exchanged glances but said nothing. "That's what I thought," Lisa said. "You just assumed. And now we're all going to pay for it." As the plane continued its journey toward Chicago, the videos spread across the internet. News outlets picked up the story. Black executive dragged from first class on airline he's about to lead. Comment sections filled with outrage. The airline's social media team was overwhelmed. In the executive offices in Chicago, phones rang constantly. The current CEO paced back and forth, barking orders. "I want those flight attendants suspended the moment they land. Get legal on the phone. And somebody find out how the hell this happened." An assistant hurried in. "Sir, Mr. Johnson is requesting a press conference upon arrival." The CEO stopped pacing. "Of course he is. Set it up, and pray he doesn't decide to sue us all into oblivion." Back on the plane, Thomas finally accepted a drink from a nervous flight attendant, not Rebecca or Paul, who had made themselves scarce. The elderly woman next to him had woken up and was staring at him with newfound respect. "You know," she said quietly, I've been flying this airline for 40 years. They could use someone like you in charge." Thomas smiled. "We'll see if they still want me after today." But he already knew what he was going to do. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly, removed unjustly, assumed not to belong. As the new CEO, he would have the power to ensure this never happened again, not on his airline. He typed one final message before the descent began. "Don't fire anyone yet. I have other plans." As the plane began its approach to Chicago, Thomas looked out the window at the city skyline coming into view. It wasn't the triumphant arrival he had imagined, but perhaps it would lead to something even more meaningful. The plane had been in the air for just over 2 hours when the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I need all cabin crew to report to the forward galley immediately. All cabin crew to the forward galley, please." Passengers exchanged curious glances. It was unusual for all flight attendants to be called away at once. Thomas watched as the remaining attendants hurried toward the front of the plane, their faces tense. He checked his watch. They were about halfway to Chicago. He wondered what was happening, though he had a pretty good idea. Up in the forward galley, Lisa, the chief flight attendant, gathered her team around her. Her face was ashen as she held up her tablet. "We have an urgent message from headquarters," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need everyone to listen carefully." Rebecca fidgeted nervously with her scarf. Paul stared at the floor, avoiding eye contact with his colleagues. "The passenger in 32B, Lisa continued, "the one who was removed from first class, and his name is Thomas Johnson." "We know that already," Rebecca muttered. Lisa shot her a sharp look. "What you don't know is that Thomas Johnson is the incoming CEO of Skyway Airlines. The announcement was supposed to be made upon his arrival in Chicago today." A collective gasp went through the group. One flight attendant actually covered her mouth in shock. "That's impossible," Rebecca whispered. "He wasn't dressed like... he didn't look like..." "Like what?" Lisa asked coldly. Rebecca fell silent, realizing there was no good way to finish that sentence. "The acquisition deal was finalized last night," Lisa continued, reading from her tablet. "It was kept confidential until the formal announcement. Mr. Johnson is not just taking over as CEO. His company has purchased a controlling interest in Skyway. As of this morning, he effectively owns this airline." Paul leaned against the wall for support. "We're fired," he said flatly. "We're all fired." "Not yet," Lisa replied, "but headquarters is in crisis mode. The videos of the incident are everywhere. Our social media team can't keep up with the backlash. The current CEO is planning to meet Mr. Johnson at the gate with a public apology." "What do they want us to do?" asked another flight attendant. Lisa scrolled through the message. "They want us to make the remainder of his flight as comfortable as possible, without drawing further attention to the situation. And they want Rebecca and Paul to stay away from him entirely." Rebecca's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This is ridiculous. How are we supposed to know? He was wearing jeans and a t-shirt." "So?" challenged another flight attendant, a younger man named David. "I wear jeans when I travel too. Does that mean I don't deserve to be in the seat I paid for?" "You know that's not what I meant," Rebecca snapped. "Then what did you mean?" David pressed. "Because from where I was standing, you took one look at him and decided he didn't belong in first class. You didn't even properly check his ticket." Paul stepped between them. "That's enough. Fighting won't solve anything. The damage is done." Lisa nodded grimly. "Paul's right. We need to focus on damage control now. David, you'll take over serving the economy section where Mr. Johnson is sitting. Be attentive but not obsequious. Don't draw attention to his status." David nodded and headed back to his station. "What about us?" Rebecca asked, gesturing to herself and Paul. "You two stay up here in first class. Don't go near him unless he specifically asks for you." Lisa's tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. As the flight attendants dispersed, Lisa pulled Rebecca aside. "I've worked with you for 5 years," she said quietly. "I've never seen you make a mistake like this. What happened?" Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. I don't know, he didn't look like he belonged there. You know how many times people try to sneak into first class? Lisa shook her head. That's not good enough, Becca. Not by a long shot. If he decides to press charges for discrimination, your career is over. Maybe all our careers. Back in economy, Thomas noticed the shift in the crew's behavior. The flight attendants who had been avoiding his section were now being replaced by others who hadn't been involved in the earlier incident. They were professional but clearly uncomfortable, stealing glances at him when they thought he wasn't looking. His phone buzzed with yet another message from the board. They had set up the press conference as he requested. The current CEO, Richard Wilson, would meet him at the gate and they would address the media together. The PR team had prepared statements for both of them. Thomas opened the attachment and read the statement they wanted him to give. It was conciliatory, focused on moving forward, emphasizing that he didn't want to dwell on unfortunate misunderstandings. It made no mention of discrimination or racial profiling. He deleted the attachment and typed back, "I'll write my own statement, thank you." The young man sitting across the aisle leaned over. "Hey, is it true what they're saying? Are you really the new boss of this airline?" Thomas smiled tiredly. "News travels fast." "Man, that's wild." The young man shook his head in disbelief. "Those flight attendants must be freaking out right now." "I imagine they are," Thomas agreed. "What are you going to do to them?" The young man asked eagerly. "Fire them on the spot?" Thomas considered the question. "What do you think I should do?" The young man didn't hesitate. "Fire them for sure. Maybe sue the airline too. Make them pay." An elderly woman across the aisle joined the conversation. "That's not the right approach, young man. Violence begets violence, even if it's just career violence." "It's not about violence," the young man argued. "It's about consequences. They humiliated him in front of everyone." Other passengers were turning around now, joining the impromptu debate. Thomas listened quietly as they discussed what they would do in his position. Some called for harsh punishment, others for forgiveness, and still others for systemic change. A middle-aged woman 2 rows ahead turned around. "The real question isn't what happens to those 2 flight attendants," she said thoughtfully. "The real question is what happens to the culture that made them think their behavior was acceptable in the first place." Thomas nodded, appreciating her insight. This was bigger than 2 flight attendants making a bad call. This was about unconscious bias that permeated the entire organization and society as a whole. "Whatever you decide," said the elderly woman next to him, patting his hand. "You have an opportunity here. People are watching. Make it count." The conversation died down as David, the flight attendant, approached with a drink cart. "Can I get anyone something to drink?" he asked, his voice unnaturally bright. The passengers ordered their drinks, and when David reached Thomas, he gave a small, nervous smile. "Anything for you, sir?" "Just water, please," Thomas replied. "And maybe a moment of your time when you're not busy." David looked surprised but nodded. "Of course, sir. I'll be back shortly." As promised, David returned a few minutes later. "You wanted to speak with me, sir?" Thomas gestured to the empty seat beside him. The young man who had been sitting there had gone to the restroom. "Have a seat for a moment, if you don't mind." David glanced nervously toward the front of the plane but sat down. "How can I help you, sir?" "How long have you been with Skyway?" Thomas asked. 3 years next month, David replied. "And do you enjoy your work?" David seemed surprised by the question. "Most days, yes. I love traveling and meeting different people. But, Thomas prompted. David lowered his voice. "But days like today make it hard. What happened to you?" "It's not the first time I've seen something like that." Thomas nodded, unsurprised. "Have you ever reported these incidents?" David gave a small, bitter laugh. "There's no point. The reports disappear into HR and nothing changes. Besides, it's not always as obvious as what happened with you. Sometimes it's just a tone of voice, or who gets helped first, or who gets questioned about their ticket." "I understand," Thomas said. "And if you had the power to change things, what would you do differently?" David thought for a moment. Honestly, I'd start with training, real training, not just the superficial diversity workshops we get now. And I'd change how we measure success. Right now, it's all about efficiency and customer satisfaction scores. But those scores come mostly from certain types of passengers. Interesting, Thomas said. Would you be willing to put these ideas in writing for me, once I officially start as CEO? David's eyes widened. You're serious? You actually want my input? I am, and I do, Thomas confirmed. Sometimes the best insights come from people on the front lines. Their conversation was interrupted by the return of the young man, who looked surprised to find his seat occupied by a flight attendant. David jumped up quickly. Thank you for your time, Thomas said. We'll continue this conversation in Chicago. As David moved on with his drink service, the captain's voice came over the intercom again. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for arrival. Thomas looked out the window at the clouds below them. In less than an hour, he would step off this plane and into a storm of his own making. The press would be waiting. The current CEO would be there with his rehearsed apology. The board would be watching anxiously to see how he handled his first public appearance. But Thomas wasn't thinking about any of that. He was thinking about David's words, about the elderly woman's advice, about the middle-aged passenger's insight. He was thinking about all the people who had ever been made to feel they didn't belong in spaces they had every right to occupy. His phone buzzed one more time. A message from his assistant. Press gathering at gate, at least a dozen outlets. How do you want to play this? Thomas typed back quickly. Honest, direct, no sugarcoating. This isn't about me. It's about fixing a broken culture. He put his phone away and fastened his seatbelt as the plane began to descend through the clouds. The incident that had begun as a personal humiliation had transformed into something much larger, a catalyst for change. And Thomas was ready to embrace that responsibility. As the plane broke through the cloud layer, the sprawling cityscape of Chicago came into view. Somewhere down there, a team of executives was waiting nervously. A press corps was setting up cameras, and social media was still buzzing with the story of what had happened on this flight. Thomas took a deep breath. His first day as CEO was starting earlier than planned under circumstances no one could have predicted, but perhaps that was fitting. Real change rarely happened according to schedule. The plane banked gently, lining up for its final approach. In the first-class cabin, Rebecca and Paul sat in tense silence, dreading the moment when the wheels would touch down and they would have to face the consequences of their actions. In the cockpit, the captain and co-pilot exchanged worried glances as they guided the aircraft toward the runway. They had both received the message about their incoming CEO and the incident that had occurred on their watch. And in seat 32B, squeezed uncomfortably between two other passengers, Thomas Johnson prepared to step into his new role, not just as a CEO, but as someone with the power and platform to address a problem much bigger than one bad day on an airplane. The plane's wheels touched down with a screech, and a new chapter began. The plane rolled to a stop at the gate, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. Normally, this would trigger an immediate rush of passengers standing to retrieve their belongings, but today, something strange happened. No one moved. Instead, all eyes turned toward Thomas, waiting to see what would happen next. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to touch. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Local time is 11:42 a.m. and the temperature is 72 degrees. Please remain seated for a special announcement. There was a pause, then. We've been informed that there will be a brief delay before deplaning. We appreciate your patience. Whispers rippled through the cabin. Everyone knew something unusual was happening, and those who hadn't witnessed the earlier incident were quickly filled in by their seatmates. Thomas checked his phone one last time before putting it in airplane mode. There were dozens of missed calls and messages, but one caught his eye. A text from the current CEO, Richard Wilson. Waiting at the gate. Press is everywhere. How do you want to handle this? Thomas didn't reply. He knew Wilson well enough from their negotiations over the past few months. The man was all about damage control, and right now he'd be focused on minimizing the company's liability rather than addressing the real issue. Lisa, the chief flight attendant, appeared at his side. "Mr. Johnson," she said quietly, "there's a welcoming committee waiting for you at the gate. They've asked that you be the first to deplane. Would that be acceptable to you?" Thomas considered this. "Actually, no," he said. "I'll exit with everyone else in the normal order of deplaning." Lisa looked surprised but nodded. "As you wish, sir. Is there anything else we can do for you?" "Yes," Thomas said. "Please inform the captain that I'd like to speak with Rebecca and Paul before we land." Lisa hesitated. "Sir, I'm not sure that's advisable. Legal has suggested—" "I'm not interested in what legal has suggested," Thomas interrupted gently. "This is between me and them. Please ask them to meet me here." Lisa nodded and hurried away. The passengers around Thomas watched with undisguised interest. A few minutes later, Rebecca and Paul made their way down the aisle, looking as though they were walking to their own execution. They stopped a few feet from Thomas's seat. "You wanted to see us, sir?" Paul asked, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the plane. Thomas nodded. "I did. I thought we should talk before we step off this plane and into the circus that's waiting for us." Rebecca stared at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. Paul stood stiffly, his hands clasped behind his back. "First," Thomas said, "I want you both to understand that what happens next isn't entirely up to me. There will be an investigation, and there may be consequences beyond my control." They both nodded grimly. "But," Thomas continued, "I want you to know what I'm going to say to the press when they ask me what should happen to you." Rebecca finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "I'm going to say that firing you would be the easy solution, but not the right one," Thomas said. "I'm going to say that what happened today is a symptom of a much larger problem, and that addressing that problem requires honesty, not scapegoating." Paul's shoulders relaxed slightly, but confusion was written across his face. "I don't understand, sir. Are you saying we won't lose our jobs?" "I'm saying that your future with the company will depend on what happens next," Thomas replied. "On whether you're willing to be part of the solution." "What solution?" Rebecca asked, speaking for the first time. "What exactly do you want from us?" Thomas leaned forward in his seat. "I want you to tell the truth, not just about what happened today, but about why it happened, about the assumptions you made, the shortcuts your mind took, about the culture that made those assumptions seem reasonable to you in the moment." Rebecca shook her head. "You want us to admit to being racist on national television? That's career suicide." "I'm not asking you to label yourself," Thomas clarified. "I'm asking you to be honest about what happened and why, about the split-second judgments we all make based on appearances, about how those judgments affect real people every day." Paul nodded slowly. "And if we do this, if we participate in this conversation, then you'll keep your jobs," Thomas said, "though there may be some form of disciplinary action, but more importantly, you'll be part of making sure this doesn't happen to someone else." Before either could respond, the plane gave a small lurch as it connected to the jetway. They had arrived. "Think about it," Thomas said. "We'll talk more after the press conference." As Rebecca and Paul returned to the front of the plane, the doors opened and the captain announced that passengers could now disembark. True to his word, Thomas waited his turn, letting the first-class passengers exit first, followed by those in premium economy. When it was finally time for his row to leave, he stood and gathered his things. Walking down the jetway, he could already hear the commotion waiting for him. As he emerged into the terminal, he was momentarily blinded by camera flashes. A crowd had gathered: journalists, airport staff, curious travelers, and, at the front, Richard Wilson, flanked by members of the board. Wilson stepped forward immediately, hand extended, a practiced look of concern on his face. "Thomas," he said loudly for the benefit of the cameras, "on behalf of everyone at Skyway Airlines, I want to extend our sincerest apologies for the inexcusable treatment you received today." Thomas shook his hand briefly. Thank you, Richard. I appreciate that. But I think we should save the formal statements for the press conference. Wilson nodded, looking relieved. He leaned in closer. The board is waiting in the VIP lounge. They want to talk strategy before we face the press. Thomas glanced at the crowd of reporters. Let them wait, he said. There's something I need to do first. He turned back toward the gate where passengers from his flight were still emerging. Many stopped to watch the scene unfolding, while others hurried past, eager to avoid the commotion. Thomas spotted the elderly woman who had sat beside him in economy. She was struggling with a heavy carry-on bag. He walked over to her, ignoring Wilson's confused expression. Let me help you with that, Thomas said, taking the bag from her. The woman smiled up at him. Thank you, young man. You've had quite a day, haven't you? Thomas laughed softly. That's one way to put it. He carried her bag as they walked together toward the main concourse. I wanted to thank you for your words on the plane. They helped me gain perspective. Sometimes that's all we need, she said. A little perspective. She patted his arm. Now go do what you need to do. And remember, this moment isn't just about you, or even just about those two flight attendants. It's about all of us and how we see each other. Thomas nodded. That's exactly what I was thinking. He handed her bag to a waiting airport assistant and made his way back to Wilson and the board members, who were now huddled together, whispering urgently. The VIP lounge? Thomas asked. Wilson nodded, clearly relieved that Thomas was following the plan. They made their way through the terminal, trailed by security guards who kept the press at bay. Inside the lounge, half a dozen board members waited, along with the airline's legal counsel and PR director. Thomas, said Eleanor Hayes, the board chairwoman, stepping forward. What a terrible way to begin your tenure with us. I want you to know that the board stands behind you completely. Those responsible will be terminated immediately. Thomas held up a hand. Before we get into that, I'd like to hear what the PR team has prepared for the press conference. The PR director, a nervous-looking man named Greg, handed him a tablet. We've drafted statements for both you and Richard. We're positioning this as an unfortunate, isolated incident that doesn't reflect our company values. We've emphasized your agreement that swift action will be taken against the employees involved. Thomas read through the statements, his expression unreadable. When he finished, he handed the tablet back to Greg. These statements, he said quietly, mention nothing about racial profiling or discrimination. Greg exchanged glances with the legal counsel. We thought it best to avoid those terms as they could increase our liability. I see, Thomas said. And have you spoken with Rebecca and Paul about this? About what they'll say when reporters inevitably track them down? They'll be instructed not to speak to the press at all, the legal counsel replied firmly. Standard protocol in situations like this. Thomas nodded slowly, then turned to address the entire room. I understand the instinct to protect the company, to minimize damage and move on as quickly as possible. But I think that approach would be a mistake. Eleanor frowned. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting, Thomas said, that we use this moment, that instead of hiding from it, we face it head on, that we acknowledge not just what happened on that plane, but why it happened. The room fell silent. Wilson cleared his throat. Thomas, with all due respect, this isn't the time for a social justice campaign. We need to contain this situation before it affects our stock price any further. It's already affecting your stock price, Thomas pointed out, and firing 2 employees while issuing a carefully worded non-apology won't fix that. It certainly won't fix the underlying problem. Which is? Eleanor asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. A culture that allows, even encourages, snap judgments based on appearances, Thomas said. One where a man in casual clothes is automatically assumed not to belong in first class if his skin is the wrong color. The legal counsel stepped forward. Mr. Johnson, I strongly advise against making such statements publicly. They could expose the company to significant liability. Thomas smiled without humor. The company is already exposed. The only question is whether we're going to address the real issue or try to paper over it. And what do you propose? Eleanor asked, her voice careful. I propose honesty, Thomas said simply. I propose that we use this moment to launch a genuine examination of the biases that exist within this company and within the airline industry as a whole. That we commit to real change, not just damage control. The PR director looked horrified. You can't be serious. The press would have a field day with that kind of admission. The press is already having a field day, Thomas replied. But this way we control the narrative. We turn a PR crisis into an opportunity for leadership. Richard Wilson shook his head. It's too risky. The board would never— Actually, Eleanor interrupted, studying Thomas with new interest. I'd like to hear more about this approach. The others looked at her in surprise. Eleanor was known for her conservative business practices and risk aversion. You're serious? Wilson asked incredulously. Eleanor nodded. The landscape is changing. Richard, companies that ignore issues of bias and discrimination don't just face bad press. They face lawsuits, boycotts, and talent drain. Perhaps Thomas is right. Perhaps this is an opportunity. The room erupted in debate. Some board members sided with Eleanor, seeing the potential for a bold new direction. Others aligned with Wilson, arguing for a more traditional approach to crisis management. Through it all, Thomas remained calm, listening to both sides. Finally, Eleanor called for quiet. We've been in here for 20 minutes. The press is waiting. We need to decide on our approach now. All eyes turned to Thomas. As the incoming CEO and the person directly affected by the incident, his opinion carried significant weight. Here's what I propose, he said. I'll speak from my own experience. I'll be honest about what happened and how it made me feel. I won't make sweeping accusations, but I won't pretend this was just a misunderstanding either. He turned to the legal counsel. You can review my remarks to ensure they don't create undue liability, but I won't water down the truth. The lawyer nodded reluctantly. And what about the flight attendants? Wilson asked. They'll be suspended pending an investigation, Thomas said. But I don't want them fired, at least not yet. I want them to be part of the conversation we're about to start. Eleanor exchanged glances with the other board members, then nodded decisively. Very well. Let's proceed with Thomas's approach. They prepared to leave for the press conference. Wilson pulled Thomas aside. Are you sure about this? Once you start down this road, there's no turning back. Thomas smiled. I've never been more sure of anything. This isn't how I planned to begin my tenure as CEO, but maybe it's exactly how I needed to. Together, they walked out to face the press, ready to turn an incident of discrimination into a catalyst for change. 6 months had passed since that fateful flight. The midday sun streamed through the large windows of Skyway Airlines' newly renovated training center as Thomas stood before a group of 50 employees. Some were new hires, others were veterans with decades of experience. All were there for the same reason, to participate in the company's completely redesigned training program. Welcome to day one, Thomas said, his voice calm but commanding. Some of you are probably wondering why your CEO is personally leading this session instead of being upstairs in his office. A few nervous laughs rippled through the audience. The answer is simple, he continued. What we're doing here today is the most important work happening in this company. More important than our quarterly earnings, more important than our route expansions, more important than any merger or acquisition. He paused, looking around the room. 6 months ago, I had an experience on one of our flights that many of you have heard about. It wasn't pleasant. It wasn't something I would wish on anyone. But it revealed something important. A blind spot in our culture that needed addressing. At the back of the room, Rebecca sat with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Beside her was Paul, looking slightly more relaxed but still uncomfortable. Both had been through a challenging half-year, suspended for the first 2 months before being allowed to return to work in ground operations while they completed the new training program. Today was their final session, after which they would be eligible to return to flight duties if they chose. What happened that day wasn't just about 2 flight attendants making a bad call, Thomas continued. It was about systems and assumptions that have been baked into our industry, into our society for generations. The easy thing would have been to fire those employees and move on, to pretend it was just one isolated incident. He stepped away from the podium and walked closer to the group. But the easy thing isn't always the right thing. And as your CEO, I'm committed to doing what's right, not what's easy. The training center doors opened, and a woman in her mid-30s entered, carrying a tablet. This was Dr. Nadia Chen, the renowned expert in organizational psychology who had been hired to develop Skyway's new training protocols. I'll let Dr. Chen take over from here, Thomas said. But before I go, I want each of you to know something important. This isn't sensitivity training. This isn't about political correctness or saying the right words. This is about seeing each person who boards our planes as exactly that, a person, not a stereotype, not a category, not a snap judgment. A person deserving of respect and fair treatment. That's the standard we're setting at Skyway Airlines, and it's non-negotiable. As Thomas stepped aside, Dr. Chen took his place at the front of the room. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. As he mentioned, I'm Dr. Chen, and I'll be guiding you through this week's sessions. But before we dive in, I'd like to start with a question. How many of you have ever felt judged unfairly based on your appearance? Nearly every hand in the room went up, including Rebecca's and Paul's. Keep those hands up, Dr. Chen said. Now, how many of you have ever made a quick judgment about someone else based on their appearance? Be honest. After a moment of hesitation, most hands stayed raised. Thank you for your honesty, Dr. Chen said. That's where we'll begin today, not with blame or shame, but with honesty, because we can't change what we don't acknowledge. Thomas watched from the side of the room as Dr. Chen launched into the first module of the training. The program they'd developed together over the past 6 months was unlike anything previously attempted in the airline industry. It combined practical scenarios with psychological insights, real passenger experiences with data analysis. It wasn't about following a script, it was about changing a mindset. As the session continued, Thomas slipped quietly out of the room. He had a board meeting to attend, where he would present the latest results of their transformation initiative. The elevator ride to the executive floor gave him a moment to reflect on the whirlwind of the past 6 months. The press conference after the flight had generated exactly the media storm Wilson had feared. For weeks, Skyway Airlines had been at the center of a national conversation about race, class, and air travel, but instead of retreating from the spotlight, Thomas had leaned into it. He had shared his story openly, not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as a leader identifying a problem that needed solving. He had invited Rebecca and Paul to tell their side too, which they eventually did, after initial resistance. The elevator. Doors opened to the executive floor where Thomas's assistant was waiting. The board is ready for you, she said, handing him a tablet with the latest data. And the quarterly numbers just came in. They're better than projected. Thomas smiled. Thanks, Jenny. Let's not keep them waiting. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was markedly different from that tense day 6 months ago. Eleanor Hayes still presided at the head of the table, but several new faces had joined the board, part of Thomas's effort to bring diverse perspectives into the company's leadership. Thomas, Eleanor said warmly as he entered, we're eager to hear your update. The early numbers look promising. Thomas took his seat and activated the large screen at the front of the room. A series of graphs appeared, showing customer satisfaction scores, employee retention rates, and booking trends. As you can see, he began, our bold approach is paying dividends. Customer satisfaction is up 12% overall, with particularly strong gains among minority passengers. Employee retention has improved, and our bookings have recovered completely from the initial dip we experienced after the incident. A board member at the far end of the table looked skeptical. And the costs of this new training program? The additional staff for your passenger experience team, are they justified by these results? Thomas nodded, having anticipated this question. If we're looking purely at short-term financial metrics, the costs are significant, but they're already being offset by reduced turnover, fewer customer complaints, and most significantly, increased customer loyalty among demographics we previously struggled to attract. He advanced to the next slide, which showed long-term projections. More importantly, we're building a foundation for sustainable growth. Our brand perception has shifted from just another airline to an industry leader in customer experience for all passengers. That's not just good ethics, it's good business. Eleanor nodded approvingly. I was skeptical at first, Thomas. I won't deny it. But you've made a believer out of me. The meeting continued with updates on other initiatives, new routes, fleet expansions, technology improvements. Throughout it all, Thomas remained engaged but found his mind occasionally drifting back to the training room downstairs, where the real work of transformation was happening. After the board meeting concluded, Thomas decided to return to the training center. As he approached, he could hear lively discussion from within. Dr. Chen had the participants broken into small groups, each working through a different scenario. He entered quietly and made his way to the back of the room, where Rebecca and Paul were engaged in a heated debate with their group members. But that's exactly what I'm saying, Rebecca was insisting. Sometimes these judgments happen so fast, you don't even realize you're making them. It's not always a conscious choice. Which is why we need systems to check those unconscious biases, argued another flight attendant. If you had actually followed protocol and properly verified his boarding pass that day, none of this would have happened. Paul nodded reluctantly. She's right, Rebecca. We took shortcuts based on assumptions. That's the bottom line. Thomas was impressed. 6 months ago, neither Rebecca nor Paul had been willing to acknowledge that bias had played any role in their actions. Now they were actively engaging with the concept, even if they didn't agree on all the details. Dr. Chen noticed Thomas at the back of the room and gave him a small nod, but didn't interrupt the group discussions. This was part of their strategy. Let people work through these ideas themselves rather than simply being told what to think. After the session ended, as participants were gathering their things and filing out, Thomas approached Rebecca and Paul. How's it going? He asked simply. Rebecca looked surprised by the question. Despite working for the same company for 6 months, they had rarely interacted directly since the incident. It's challenging, she admitted. But good, I think. It makes you see things differently. Paul nodded in agreement. I never thought I'd say this, but I'm grateful for this program. Not for how we got here, he added hastily, but for what I've learned. I'm glad to hear that, Thomas said. I actually came down to ask you both something. We're forming a new advisory group focused on passenger experience. It will report directly to me and have significant input on our service policies going forward. I'd like you both to consider joining it. Rebecca's eyes widened. Us? After what we did? Because of what you did, Thomas corrected. And because of what you've done since. You've gone through this process with honesty and courage. That's exactly the perspective this group needs. Paul looked thoughtful. You know, when this all started, I thought you just kept us around for PR reasons, to show how forgiving and progressive you were. Thomas laughed. If I'd wanted good PR, I would have fired you both immediately and moved on. That would have been the easy move. This, actually addressing the real issue, has been much harder. For all of us. Rebecca hesitated, then asked the question that had clearly been on her mind for months. Can I ask, why didn't you just fire us? You had every right to. Thomas considered his answer carefully. Because firing you wouldn't have changed anything. It would have made some people feel better briefly, but the next week or the next month, the same thing would have happened to someone else, on another flight or in another company. The problem was never just about you two, it was about a culture that needed changing. He looked from Rebecca to Paul. So what do you say? Are you interested in being part of that change? They exchanged glances, and then Paul spoke. I'm in. I can't think of more important work to be doing. Rebecca nodded, slowly. Me too, though I have to admit I'm still shocked you'd want us involved after everything that happened. That's exactly why I want you involved, Thomas said. This isn't about pretending the incident never happened. It's about learning from it and building something better. As they talked further about the details of the advisory group, Thomas's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Jenny, his assistant. CNN just released their list of most admired companies. We made the top 10. They specifically cited our bold approach to addressing bias in customer service as a factor. Thomas smiled slightly but didn't mention the news to Rebecca and Paul. This wasn't about accolades or recognition. It was about creating lasting change. Later that evening, as Thomas prepared to leave the office, he paused at the large window overlooking the airport. Below, Skyway planes taxied across the tarmac, carrying thousands of passengers to destinations around the world. He thought about that morning 6 months ago, when he had boarded a flight expecting nothing more than a routine trip. How quickly it had turned into something else entirely. How a moment of humiliation had transformed into an opportunity for meaningful change. The changes at Skyway were already spreading beyond the company itself. Other airlines had begun to take notice, some implementing their own versions of the training program. Industry publications had covered their approach extensively, and Thomas had been invited to speak at conferences about creating inclusive customer experiences. But the most meaningful result wasn't measured in headlines or speaking invitations. It was in the small interactions happening thousands of times a day across their network. It was in the flight attendant who paused before making an assumption, in the gate agent who double-checked a policy instead of applying it rigidly, in the countless passengers who now felt truly welcome aboard their flights. As he watched a Skyway plane lift into the evening sky, Thomas thought about the question Rebecca had asked earlier. Why hadn't he just fired them and moved on? The answer was simpler than he had explained. Because firing them would have been about the past, about punishment for what had already occurred. And from the moment he had stepped off that plane into a storm of cameras and questions, Thomas had been focused on the future, a future where a person's appearance didn't determine how they were treated, where assumptions were challenged rather than acted upon, where everyone, passengers and employees alike, was seen as an individual worthy of respect. That future wasn't fully realized yet. There would be more incidents, more mistakes, more learning needed. The work was far from finished. But as Thomas gathered his things and headed for the elevator, he felt something that had been in short supply during those tense days after the incident. Hope. Not just for his company, but for the ripple effects its transformation might create in the wider world. Sometimes, he reflected as the elevator doors closed, it took an uncomfortable moment of truth to create the possibility for real change. 6 months ago, he had been dragged out of first class and humiliated in front of a plane full of strangers. Today, he was leading an organization that was setting new standards for the industry. It wasn't the path he would have chosen, but standing here now, he wouldn't change a thing about where it had led.